we may find that most of us have had it and didn't even know.
Certain ethnic minorities are more likely to get the disease and more likely to die of the disease.
People do want to go to the parks. They want to go outside.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Libby Znaimer.
Welcome to the Zoomer. I'm Libby Znaimer. In the beginning, we saw it as another flu-type virus, but it has evolved into the biggest pandemic in over 100 years. As we continue sheltering at home, experts say we're still in the beginning stages of understanding the biology and evolution of COVID-19. Social distancing has been effective, with fewer people than feared infected and dying, at least here in Canada. Yet the authorities warn the worst may still be ahead. And questions remain. Why do some people become gravely ill while others have no symptoms? How many people are asymptomatic carriers? Why is COVID deadlier for people of color and men? Before we dive in, let's tee up the topic.
An analysis of data from China showed that those with mild or no symptoms were the source of 80% of documented cases of COVID-19. That's because people were unknowingly spreading the virus. Even in the midst of lockdowns, 10% of new U.S. COVID infections are spread by healthy-looking people. And as much as 25% of all U.S. cases remain asymptomatic. In the Italian town of Vo, where Italy recorded its first death, a majority of those who tested positive had no symptoms. And large-scale testing in Iceland found that about half of positive cases were symptom-free. These figures highlight big gaps in our understanding of why some people are more susceptible to infection than others.
We're joined by Dr. Shaf Keshavjee, a lung specialist and thoracic surgeon, Dr. Rewat Deonandan, an epidemiologist, Andrew Hessel, a microbiologist and geneticist, and Dr. Joshua Tepper, a family physician and hospital CEO. One of the most confounding aspects of the virus is the huge divergence in how it affects us. For some, it causes no symptoms and sickness at all. For others, it inflicts severe disease and death. We do know it tends to attack the lungs. Dr. Keshavjee?
Well, the COVID-19 is a member of the family of coronaviruses and has been shown to be a particularly dangerous one or risky one, as you've seen around, as it traveled around the world. One of the areas that I am most interested in is the host response, because as you know, everybody who gets infected, the vast majority get over it and they have a cold or a bad flu and they recover, but a few people get very sick. And so what we're focusing on is what kills these people is not necessarily the virus itself, but the host response to the virus, the inflammatory response. And we have been studying that in other types of flus. We studied it in H1N1. And we've seen that there are certain biomarkers or cytokines that we release at cells in our body and in our lung release in response to an inflammatory stimulus. And sometimes we just overdo it, and that becomes that inflammatory response.
You're a transplant surgeon. Does that have any parallels with rejection when you're transplanting an organ or anything like that?
Yeah, it's not so much rejection, but the other side of the immune system called the innate immune system. So the rejection is the acquired immune system, or seeing something as foreign and rejecting it. The innate immune system is the inflammation immune system or response to something. Now, why I'm involved in this area is when we look at donor lungs to evaluate them, that is this lung good enough to transplant, and will the inflammation when you put the lung in be added to existing inflammation in the lung. We developed tests to rapidly assess donor lungs to see if there's inflammation in them, and lo and behold, those are the same signs of inflammation that you see with COVID. And so we're applying that technology to rapidly assess patients in the emergency room to say, you might have COVID, but you don't have a bad inflammatory response, and you can go home and recover by yourself and self-isolating, or you have signs of a serious inflammatory response, and we should admit you, watch you, and then treat the inflammation.
I've heard it described that what it does is it almost liquefies people's lungs in bad cases.
It's a fairly graphic description that isn't entirely accurate. What's actually happening is that your body is mounting an extreme immune response that includes the production of fluids, mucus, and so forth. So it's your body producing all this stuff. And frankly, one of the ways in which people die is that they're almost drowning in their own body fluids. So the lungs aren't turning to liquid, but fluids are being released by the sacs within the lung, mucus as well. And that's the experience that some of the worst cases are having.
Dr. Hessel, you're a geneticist. What about a genetic component of this?
I've been tracking this virus from the early days in January. What's really been fascinating is that the entire genetic sequence of the virus was published very quickly by the Chinese authorities and scientists, literally on January 10th, I believe. So that's really catalyzed a lot of analysis by many groups around the world, as well as accelerated the development of diagnostic tests and vaccines and other therapeutics. So genetics has played a significant role just in understanding this particular virus, as well as looking for particular traits in different individuals that might make them more susceptible.
Josh Tepper, you run a hospital. So what conclusions have you drawn from seeing people with such divergent experiences of this disease?
What it means is we have to structure our healthcare system to be able to accommodate a disease that presents itself very widely and in a wide variety of different ways. So absolutely, we've had to build up our intensive care system, our ventilator support, and there's been a lot of discussion. But because it's so broad and often mild or no symptoms, we also have to think about this from the perspective of the emergency room, our labor and delivery room, our long-term care homes. And so we have to have a system that's ready to take care of people at the most extreme, severe forms of this, as very graphically described, but also people with milder symptoms, but the ability to either get sick very quickly or the ability, even if they don't get sick, to infect others. And so it's that complexity of the presentation that's been a real challenge.
Okay, we have to take a short break. We'll be back with more.
We know that certain ethnic minorities are more likely to get the disease and more likely to die of the disease.
Welcome back. When it comes to COVID-19, there is a race gap, with Blacks and other people of color disproportionately affected. Recently, the Centers for Disease Control in the U.S. found that 33% of people who've been hospitalized with the virus are African American, yet they represent only 13% of the American population. In cities like New Orleans and Chicago, the vast majority of fatalities have been African Americans. Is it because they're more likely to be affected by other risk factors like diabetes and obesity? Is it because they have less access to health care and are more likely to work in settings where they're exposed to infection? Or is there a genetic component? Here in Canada, we don't even keep statistics relating to race. I'd like to bring in Ralston King, a city councillor in the Ottawa area who has long called for public health data to be made available to better serve marginalized citizens. Ralston, welcome, and why is this so important?
Thank you. It's really important because we are in the middle of a pandemic, as we know. This is an unprecedented public health crisis, which really requires data. I mean, in order for us to make informed decisions about how the public healthcare system should function and how services should be delivered, we have to have high quality disaggregated data about the people who are being affected and the people who need treatment. And so in the United States, as you had referenced, we do know that there has been challenges based on data in certain metropolitan areas like New York City and Chicago around a disproportionate number of Black Americans, African Americans having challenges with COVID-19, especially since they have a lot of pre-existing conditions that can create challenges if you obtain this respiratory illness. So it's absolutely important for us to have data. I mean, they have data, they're collecting that. It's important for us to have that data in order to make quality decisions.
Dr. Tepper, in your hospital, have you seen that play out, that people of color are disproportionately affected?
Unfortunately, I haven't been able to look at the data per se. I think it's a really important issue. I think one thing we're learning through this process is that the structural inequities, the structural racism that embeds our healthcare system and our society more broadly just gets exacerbated in these times. So there may be a genetic component to it, but I absolutely think there are fundamental structural inequity issues in our society for certain populations that really put certain groups more at risk at a time like this. You mentioned some of them: housing, places of employment, comorbidities and other health issues that again relate to poverty and things like that. Access to healthcare is another one. So I think it's important we collect this data. I think it's important that we design our healthcare system during this pandemic to be more mindful of these inequities. And if there's one of the many lessons going forward out of this, is we need to address these inequities in the future.
Dr. Hessel, in something like this, how do you tease out, nature versus nurture?
It takes time. There is a lot of analysis going on right now, a lot of data, but it's noisy. It takes time to start to collect this data, tease it apart, really crunch the numbers to determine what, if anything, is related to the virus versus the host. This will take some time. Dr.
Deonandan?
Yeah, so this is the age-old question of correlation and causation. So we know that certain ethnic minorities are more likely to get the disease and more likely to die of the disease, at least from the data we have available. So in the US, we think that Black Americans are about 2.5 times more likely to die of COVID than Latinos are. And Latinos are 2.5 times more likely to die than Asians are, and Asians are 2 to 3 times more likely to die than whites are. Now, that might be a genetic thing, but it might not be. And this is where it's difficult to show how much ethnicity is correlated with socioeconomic status and the lifestyle demands and experiences that correlate with that. Poorer people forced to live in crowded environments, forced to do hands-on labor, forced into conditions where they can't social distance, are also less likely to access healthcare services, less likely to take time off work, that sort of thing. That manifests as long-term chronic issues like obesity and diabetes and asthma and hypertension that doesn't kill you until years later, until something like this infectious disease pops in and forces it to the forefront. So again, what we might be seeing here with this ethnic breakdown of serious cases is long-term unwellness manifesting as short-term death.
What about the fact that men are more likely to have severe illness and to die?
There are theories about whether some of the female hormones are protective of disease, like heart disease and other areas, and also in the area we were discussing in terms of the inflammatory response, it definitely is more modulated or controlled by estrogen and other hormones. So it may well be that that's a protective factor or a risk factor in males.
If that were the case, wouldn't we see older women kind of dying at the same rate as older men?
Across the board, across the world, what we see is that men tend to do worse than women health-wise. And that's probably due to a number of things. It could be genetic, it could be biological. The Y chromosome is more fragile than the X chromosome. It could be behavioral. Men have more risky lifestyles. Men are more likely to smoke. Men are less likely to seek medical care. And these things on aggregate manifest as higher death rates among men. There's also a theory that the reproductive experience compels a greater immune capacity amongst women. All these things are unclear. I think it's highly likely that we're looking at smoking behaviors and other unwellness, particularly amongst older men as compared to women.
Okay, stay with us. We'll be back in a few minutes.
We may find that most of us have had it and didn't even know.
Welcome back. One of the biggest questions right now is when will there be a vaccine or a cure for COVID-19? Open science is allowing experts around the globe to work together to understand the virus. Plasma given by COVID-19 survivors, so-called liquid gold, since plasma contains antibodies, could be a key. Drugs like remdesivir, an experimental treatment for other coronaviruses, and even ranitidine, which is used in antacids, are being tested. But the authorities warn that a vaccine is likely at least a year away. Dr. Deonandan?
Yes, vaccines are at least 18 months away. In fact, it could be more than that, it could be decades. It might not even be possible. And so we're probably well advised to, in addition to seeking a vaccine, to think of ways of investing in public health infrastructure to allow us to live with this disease. I will say, though, that vaccine candidates, about 80 to 90 of them are being trialed right now, and they come in a variety of categories. There are vaccine candidates that focus on the virus itself. There are those that focus on other viruses that we can modify to give us an immune reaction to this virus. There are those that focus just on the RNA or DNA component of that virus. And there are those that look at just the protein subunits of the virus. Everything is being tried across the board, but I think we'll get to a therapy or a treatment well before we get to a vaccine.
Dr. Tepper?
I think it's important to just clarify, in some of the topics you mentioned in the intro there, some of those are focused on cure and some of these are about vaccines. And often it's easy to confuse the discussions that are happening. All of them are sort of emerging areas. So again, vaccines is very, very much about trying to prevent you from getting the disease in the first place. Lots of complexity. It's probably going to take some time. We have to remember there are diseases that we've been trying to develop vaccines for a couple of decades now, and we've been unsuccessful. HIV comes to mind, for example. And again, even if we can develop a vaccine, getting it tested and through to market, very, very complicated and will take time to make sure it's safe and effective. And then the question is, will it be one of those vaccines like the flu that we have to adjust it a little bit every year? Or will it be some of the other ones where, it's a very stable vaccine over time? Will we need boosters? So lots of questions in the vaccine space. And then the cure, the treatment options, again, will be really important to sort of look at. And will these be treatment for people with very mild symptoms or people for very significant disease only? Will they work equally in all groups? We've already talked about different groups being affected differently. So on the cure side as well, lots of important work ahead of us.
Well, it's interesting. I know that there's a kind of vaccine versus cure debate in medical circles. And I guess I think most people think that a cure or treatment will come before a vaccine. Dr. Hassel?
It's very likely that a treatment can come before a vaccine because, again, you give vaccines to people that are healthy, that you want to keep healthy, whereas your options in trying a therapy, even if it's experimental in someone that is in a critical case, is often warranted.
Dr. Keshavjee, it seems to me that there's I know there's a lot of collaboration, but that there's a huge competition to be the one that comes out with the vaccine. And also it looks like there are also people pushing to sort of relax the requirements for passing a vaccine.
Yeah, no, again, it's separating the issue of a vaccine from a therapy to treat a sick patient. And the therapies to treat a sick patient are things that we're moving fast with clinical trials to try and answer it in an intelligent way as to whether a patient who has that exaggerated inflammatory response would a targeted drug to a specific type of inflammation help the patient. And I think that those therapies could move faster and can get us answers earlier. And certainly the clinical trial bodies like the CIHR and so on have been fast moving to get trials approved so that we can answer these questions in a shorter timeline.
Dr. Deonandan, is this an area where we'll need personalized medicine like we have in cancer treatment, where one thing might work for one patient but not for another?
It might be. We might have to look at personalized medicine. I think that's probably not a priority at the moment. We're looking at population dynamics, not individual care. One of the therapies is convalescent serum. That's when we extract antibodies from recovered people and inject them into either well people as a prophylaxis or people with serious conditions, see if those antibodies can confer what we call passive immunity. But the problem is when you take antibodies en masse from one person, you're getting all kinds of things in that plasma with it that may cause some negative effects. If we can specify which antibodies are specific to this virus and just inject those and do other sorts of things to tailor make the therapy for the patient, directed to their gender, their age, their underlying conditions, that increases the chances of survival. So we are thinking about these things, but at a population level, it's probably not what's going to get us to a solution fastest.
Okay, we need to take a short break. Our coverage continues after the break.
Well, there's a tremendous amount of misinformation that has been floating through social media networks.
Welcome back. One of the biggest dangers of this virus is the fact that it's being spread by people who are asymptomatic. We also don't know yet if those who have recovered can be reinfected. Dr. Tepper, how can we best track this community spread?
That's a great question. It's sort of the bajillion-dollar question. The discovery that people could have asymptomatic or extremely mild symptoms was both, I think, very illuminating to explain why this was just ripping through countries and across the world the way it did, and also a really heartbreaking moment because we realized how difficult it was going to be to put our arms around it. I think we're going to have to really increase our testing capacity as much as possible. We're going to have to be very vigorous both in our testing and in our contact tracing. So test, but then when you get a positive result, you have to go out, meet with that individual or use new technologies and figure out who that person's been in touch with and quickly get those people tested. And that's going to be the only way as we start to reopen to do it. The other part, of course, is not to reopen too quickly because as they said, the asymptomatic spread, we have to be very, very cautious. And so I think the prudence about doing things in stages, phases, and waiting a period of time between each step to really see what happens with the long incubation period is going to be critical.
Ralston, how difficult is it to convince people that we have to keep socially distancing because of this asymptomatic spread?
I think it's a challenge because often people see it as a challenge, a specific challenge to their civil liberties. But I mean, we have to keep this in balance. So, my belief is that obviously we need to increase the physical distancing. I think we've been successful with that in Ottawa. Our public health agency had undertaken some polls and had determined that 70% of people are in compliance. And we're actually seeing that when we see the infection rate and our death rate, which has been, every life that's lost is a massive loss, but and it's very important that people stay at home. So I think people understand that message. Of course, Ottawa is also a very different type of city where we have a high number of people who work in an institutional setting, whether that's for governments or universities. And it allows for a lot of people to be able to work at home and to stay at home. But we have gotten some pushback because we are social beings and people do want to go to the parks. They want to go outside. But I think that as a municipality, we have had great success with ensuring that people follow the rules, they stay home, they stay safe. And it really has reduced the level of infection in our city.
Dr. Keshavjee, do other viruses or coronaviruses, do they also have asymptomatic spread? What do we know about it in general?
Well, they're related to the common cold virus. And as you know, some people get a very mild to no cold and some get really affected by it. So it's a similar concept. And, as Josh mentioned, testing will help us to figure out how it travels. I'm also very interested in testing for the antibodies because we may find that most of us have had it and didn't even know. But right now, we don't have that information. And so we don't have an idea of the magnitude of the problem, like who has not had it and is still at risk of getting it, or have a lot of people had it and recovered from it. That'll be another piece that will be helpful.
Dr. Tepper, your hand's up.
Yeah, I agree with Shav on the antibody testing. I do think we got to be a little thoughtful. We don't know for sure yet if the antibodies confer permanent immunity, temporary immunity, what happens as the virus mutates, and it's already mutating some, we know from studies. So I agree with Shav, the antibody testing I think is very helpful, but we also have to be careful about not overly vectoring in because we don't really know yet what a positive antibody will mean. Can people get reinfected or not? How long will those antibodies protect you? And also, if we start to go into these immunity passports, as we've heard people discuss, what are some of the broader sociological, ethical issues that come with that line? So again, not to disagree, but just to nuance with Shav's comments.
Just from what I see and read, it seems like a lot of people are looking at the antibody testing as kind of a magic bullet, Dr. Deonandan.
Yeah, that's a bit of a dangerous way of thinking. The antibody test is important for us to be able to track the progress of the epidemic and how close we are likely to herd immunity. You've heard that term before. But as has been noted, just because you've got antibodies doesn't mean you're immune. It might mean you're immune. You have to figure out what does it mean if you have antibodies, first of all? What level of immunity does that confer, if any at all, and how long does it last? It will eventually be an important tool that we deploy when we attempt to go back to normal, but it's not our primary tool. Our primary tool is this thing called TTI, test, trace, and isolate. So when the economy reopens, we're going to have the capacity to detect new cases in almost real time and descend upon them with enormous public health infrastructure to isolate them and to contact trace quickly. This means that the way that we do testing is going to have to change. It can't be just testing symptomatic people who call their doctors saying they've got a fever or something. There has to be some degree of random testing of the population, true prevalence studies, as we call it. And this is a kind of a surveillance system, as we call it. That's a scary word for a lot of people, but in medicine it means detecting outbreaks as they occur. And if we can deploy that sort of strategy, then we have a good chance of getting us back to a sense of pseudo-normalcy. It begins, though, with driving our caseload down to the point at which we're getting a handful of new cases every week. That way we can be sure that when signals do arise, they're new and they're small enough that we can approach them with the resources that we have.
Well, speaking of Ottawa, there's this new test out of Ottawa that supposedly gets a result very quickly in an hour, but I don't think we have a lot of those. Who knows about that?
You're talking about the Spartan Biosciences cube.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very popular. Everybody wants it. It's one of several rapid on-site tests entering the market. The Americans have one from Abbott Labs and one called the CIFIA test as well. So there are a number of them that are similar. The challenge here is making sure the sensitivity and specificity are high enough for our needs. We definitely don't want a test that has a high false negative rate, for example, which is what the previous swab test might have had. So we have to make sure that those diagnostics are in place. But then the challenge is an administrative one. Can we manufacture enough of them and distribute them on scale, at the scale that we need? We're going to need hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them.
Okay, we'll be right back after a short break.
It's incredible that Lysol had to put out a disclaimer. Like Twitter was full of people saying, don't do this. Like it was shocking.
So supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light.
An epidemic of misinformation surrounding COVID is taking an emotional and sometimes physical toll on people desperate for the slightest advantage to help survive this deadly virus.
And then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?
Recent comments by U.S. President Donald Trump suggesting that ingesting disinfectant should be investigated as a cure led to a 30% spike in calls to poison control centers and pleas from companies like Lysol asking the public to refrain from consuming their cleaning products.
The company that makes Lysol, believe it or not, had to issue this statement. We must be clear that under no circumstance should our disinfectant products be administered into the human body.
Trump has been widely criticized for these comments, and while experts scrambled to set the record straight, the comments became fodder for late-night comedy.
Dr. Clean gets stuff on viruses and does it in a minute. Dr. Clean will clean your body and every organ in it.
It wasn't Trump's first medical musing. He promoted the anti-malaria drug hydroxychloroquine as a possible game changer.
We think it has a very serious, very good impact on what we're talking about with respect to the virus. So you'll take a look at that and you can coordinate with us. But I think to me that's a game changer.
In Arizona, a man died and his wife ended up in intensive care after consuming hydroxychloroquine to help protect from COVID-19.
Did you see the president's press conference? Where did you hear about?
Yeah, we saw his press conference. It was on a lot, actually.
This as health organizations rushed to warn people about the drug's potentially lethal side effects.
We don't know if this works. There is a potential for harm here.
Okay. So what's your reaction to that, Dr. Tepper?
Well, it's preposterous that the comments were made, and it's dangerous. And it shows that in the face of uncertainty, leaders can't be musing off the cuff in ways that lead to people dying, literally dying. And I think it speaks to the responsibility that leaders have to recognize their role and to turn to experts where expert advice is needed. Overall, I'm not surprised. There's a lot of stuff out there on the internet, but to hear it from somebody people turn to for advice is beyond worrisome. And so I think, it's incredible that Lysol had to put out a disclaimer. Like Twitter was full of people saying, don't do this. Like it was shocking. It was an incredible sort of 24, 48-hour news cycle to have to live through in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was mind-boggling to see the President of the United States say such unintelligent comments on national news, and for the experts standing around him to stand there unflinching as he went on and on about this, and it ultimately led to harm of other people. I think that is just irresponsible.
You want to laugh, but it's not funny because people are getting hurt. I like to say that the best inoculation against bad ideas is a good public education system. And I think we in Canada have a good system. So we're not as vulnerable as, let's say, those south of the border might be to such ridiculous statements. The other takeaway I get from this is that this is not just a health crisis or a medical crisis or a scientific crisis. It's a leadership crisis. And we don't get through this unless our leaders are on board with proper science and taking the advice of the experts they have on hand. And here's an example of a leader not doing so. So I look to other countries whose leaders have done so, and I look at their much better progress through this epidemic. And I weep because without proper leadership and the proper expertise being brought into policymaking decisions and statements to the media, this can go awry very, very fast.
Ralston?
I have to concur. Being an elected official, where I take pride in both the city of Ottawa and also at the national level and the provincial level, is the fact that we allow our public health agencies to speak first based on evidence, and then the elected officials take action based on that evidence. So it's tremendously important for us to ensure that the policy decisions and the policy prescriptions that we make are based upon founded medical evidence. And I think that we are excelling at that in Canada. And I can also say that in the city of Ottawa, we're basically allowing our public health agency to make the lead on key decisions before the city enacts policy.
Dr. Hessel.
I think it was a low point in communicating with the U.S. public about accurate information for how they should be dealing with this pandemic. We look to these briefings to get some clue as to what's happening, when we're going to come out of lockdowns, etc. But this was truly a low point. I concur with the other statements that have been made.
Okay. Time for a short break. When we come back, final thoughts from our panelists. Welcome back. It's now time for final thoughts from our panelists, starting with Dr. Keshavjee.
Well, Libby, this has been very informative, and I think that one of the things that this pandemic has illustrated for us is the value of information transfer. And as much as we want to be evidence-based, we often had to respond very quickly without as much evidence as we would usually like. But the information transfer around the world, learning things from Italy, from Spain, and so on, allowed us to course correct in real time, and that was a wonderful thing to see. A not so wonderful thing to see was the human spirit, where certain companies started making masks that normally would be 60 cents and selling them for $16 because the world is desperate for it. And some of those unconscionable gouging moments were disheartening.
Dr. Deonandan?
Pandemics have a way of revealing the truth of a society, showing both the good and the bad, the schisms and the heroism. And I'm an optimist. I've seen the schisms that this pandemic has revealed for us, the political divides, and how responses to the evidence have fallen along political lines. That's disappointing. But I've also seen the heroism. I've seen people sacrifice their freedoms and their wealth and their treasure to protect our most vulnerable. So I take a lot of optimism away from this. I've seen the best of my neighbors and the best of my fellow Canadians. I think at the end of all this, we're going to be proud of how we responded. And regardless of the economic devastation that this will wreak, as it will, we will have saved lives, and we can't forget that.
Ralston.
Well, we are working as a community. I think that's one of the most important things that I'm taking away from this. It's really amazing to see communities, especially in the city of Ottawa, come together, working on behalf of vulnerable people. So as neighbors, we're going to come together and ensure that isolated seniors and lower income people obtain food, since there are a lot of challenges with food security. So, we're seeing a very new type of optimistic volunteerism emerge across the entire city. And I think that that's exciting, as well as people saying, we have to have a better vision of how we move forward on these issues, especially around addressing social inequity in our city. So I'm enthused. I think that after this is going to be a massive challenge, but after this, I think that we can work towards a better city, a better economy, better country.
Okay, Dr. Hessel.
Well, I think this pandemic has come at a really important time. We've been working now to improve genetic technologies for some time, and some of the work that I do is actually making synthetic viruses. We've learned that our ability to track viruses and mitigate infections needs an upgrade. And this has really been a wake-up call, a once-in-a-century wake-up call. And I think we come out of it with a better testing system, a better clinical trial system that can be more responsive, move quicker. I think we end up with a better trace and isolate network than we've ever had before. So overall, I think that biosecurity and public health end up being a lot stronger and more resilient than ever before. And this is really the first time governments and industries and individuals really have an opportunity to come together, because we've seen it affect our lives as individuals, but also affect our economies to the tune of trillions of dollars. So we'll definitely come out of this stronger and smarter.
Dr. Tepper.
So in some ways, I do share the optimism or the silver lining that my colleagues spoke to, particularly about the ability to come together as a collective. And hopefully we can now come together as a collective on other challenges we face, like climate change and some of the other really fundamental structural issues that face us globally and locally. But by the same token, I think we should also be brave enough to talk about where we failed, where we didn't move fast enough. I think we need to be brave enough to actually acknowledge we can't just go back to where we were. I think we could have done better on long-term care. I think we could have done better in some of our other preparations. And I also think we need to pay attention to the ongoing mental health issues. They were there in our society before, and they've been deeply exacerbated. I think I was deeply touched by the physician in New York who died by suicide. That got a lot of press, but I suspect there are many other cases like that that have not come to light. I think the long-term mental health burden, and I think that's just my final comment. People need to be clear, we're not going back to exactly where we were 3-4 months ago. We're going to be moving forward into a very different realm, and we need to figure out what that is together.
Well, as we just heard, when we return to our pre-pandemic lives, our normal will be a new one. And the more we understand about the biology, evolution, and course of COVID-19, the better that transition will be. That's all the time we have. Thanks for joining us.